Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am very excited today because I have a wonderful guest. Her name is Cherionna Menzam-Sills. Hello, Cherionna.
Hello, Anna. I'm so delighted to meet you and be able to do this.
The subject that we are covering today is so important, which is why I am so happy that you are here. And it comes from a marvelous book that you've written. Here it is, The Prenatal Shadow. And it goes on and it's healing the traumas experienced before and at birth. And as an analytical hypnotherapist who does from time to time come across trauma, things that happen in the womb, in utero, and certainly during birth, I was very excited to see your book. So tell us about what you mean by the prenatal shadow.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Um, so first of all, I'm using the term shadow that comes from psychoanalysis, I guess, from Jung. Carl Jung came up with the term shadow to refer to what isn't acceptable or what we grow up believing or experiencing as not acceptable and about ourselves. And so it gets pushed back into the unconscious. And it gets acted out because we're not conscious of it, so we can't be at choice about it. So it seems to me that our prenatal and birth experience is almost by definition shadow material because in our modern world, our modern Western world at least, it rarely gets acknowledged, it rarely gets reflected. Little ones aren't believed to be having experiences until they're able to talk or until they're 5 years old or something like that, and we can understand them. But we know they're having experiences in many ways. And because that experience isn't acknowledged and isn't reflected, it it's trying to get attention, right? And it comes into our behaviors and our postures and our perception and our beliefs and our relationships and everything, and can make a big mess of things. That's the short form.
Yes, and it is hugely important because we are predisposed to make assumptions about um, what nonverbal beings experience. This goes right to the heart of our relationship with animals and also, of course, our relationship with children who are pre-verbal, and this belief that somehow they don't experience or feel what we would feel at a time in their lives when they are the most vulnerable. It is the oddest thing. And I actually think that this is not so much a blind spot as a willful refusal to acknowledge that vulnerability because it makes us uncomfortable and might be a bit scary because it's too much responsibility.
Yes, but why? I think the reason it makes us feel uncomfortable is because of our own shadow. You know, we don't like to face what isn't comfortable or what isn't acceptable. And one of the things I talk about in the book, I kind of lay out all of this in the book in relation to our larger culture collective, where a masculine mentality has taken over the world, really. And, um, it sees the world, including birth and pregnancy and even embryology, as something to control and manipulate, as something mechanical and devoid of spirit, because you can't analyze spirit, you can't put it into a box. And so within that context, there's a lot that's uncomfortable. There's a lot that can't be faced, where the feminine is more holistic and embracing and relational, so making not only relationships between people, but between concepts. Things become relational between parts of the brain, even. But the masculine is more like, oh, it's like this. And this is how it is. And I'm going to tell you how it is and show you how it is and make it happen that way. That creates trauma in highly sensitive little ones. Who, as you say, they're the most vulnerable. They're also more sensitive than we are. They haven't yet developed all the defenses that we have.
Yes, and broadly speaking, we're talking about two things here. We're talking about the difference between yin and yang, as well as the materialist paradigm which predominates in our society. And I think that that materialist paradigm is responsible for pretty much everything that's wrong in the world at the moment, because it strips everything to this, well, it strips everything of spirit, as you said, and it strips everything of sanctity. There is nothing sacred. And I think that this is leading us into very difficult territory. And I think you're right in that, because that sanctity of life has been stripped away, it means that everything can be coerced and forced, and force creates trauma. So I think that this is a huge issue, and it is the very reason why the freedom movements are so prevalent in our time, because it is a response to this uncompromising view of the world as being something that you can control, or that you must control. And now that includes the entire population of the world, as well as everything else. So it's all part of the same dialogue that we are having. And it does stem from a very rigid, reductionist, materialist view of the world. So then let's look at evidence, because we're talking about memories of the in utero experience. So that's pre-birth, and some people find it a challenge to consider that we might remember things that happen in those early pre-verbal, that particularly the first couple of years. To say that we remember things that happen in the womb is an even bigger stretch. So where is the evidence for this?
Yeah, how could we possibly remember something before we can speak to tell people about it in words, or before we have much of a brain, or maybe not any of a brain or nervous system? It's not quite as far a stretch to believe that a baby that's been in the womb for 8 months might be hearing things and responding. Like, people, love to pat on the belly and feel the baby kick back. That obviously takes awareness. Okay, whether they'll remember it or not, that's another question, but it takes awareness, right? But I look at things much earlier than that. So before we even have a brain, we're having experiences. And part of the evidence is anecdotal, people talking about it, expressing it, little children when they first start to talk, drawing pictures of it or talking about it. We might not understand it, especially if that's in shadow for us. We just go, go play with this. Look at this pretty thing here, to distract them. But they seem to be having memories. But they will also act things out through their behavior. But also we know that creatures without a brain have memory. Cells have memory. Okay. Every cell is responsive to its environment. First of all, a sperm and an egg are relating to each other. They're sending messages to each other and responding. there would be no life if the sperm and the egg could not communicate. Okay, so that's a form of awareness. And we have an immune system. It's been big in the news the last several years, right? The pandemic. And, everyone's heard about the immune system by now, probably. And that's because it consists of cells, cells, not nerve cells, sorry, cells that have memory. They have awareness. They can recognize when some foreign intruder comes in, and they create a receptor site that fits that intruder so that if it comes back, another one comes back, it will recognize it and capture it. That's learning and memory. That's awareness and learning and memory on a cellular level. We could not survive without that. Okay. So it happens everywhere in our bodies. It happens everywhere in nature without a brain and a nervous system. What the brain does is it can help to organize our memories. In fact, there's research. I don't think I talk about it in this book. I talk about it in my previous book, Spirit into Form, where scientists are wondering and starting to have some evidence, they say, of memory not being in the brain. That's actually like an energetic field, and the brain is more like an antenna picking it up and organizing it. So we might not need a brain for that. Babies seem to be picking up a lot in various ways. Part of it is physiological, like through the umbilical cord, where they feel what their mother feels, basically, without necessarily understanding the context. But there seems to be energetic, vibrational, some mysterious, maybe psychic, I don't know, kind of perception similar to what happens in near-death experiences or after-death experiences when people come back. They die and they come back, and then they tell you, or they tell the people around them, what was being said about them by the practitioners down the hall. They weren't there in the physical. They weren't anywhere in the physical, apparently, but they were aware. They could say, who was in the room and all those kinds of things without having been technically alive at the time. So little ones in the womb seem to me to have a similar kind of awareness. I get chills when I talk about it. So that's something way beyond and prior to development of the brain and the nervous system, which is how most people in our modern Western world are used to thinking about learning, awareness, learning, and memory that has to happen through the brain. And it has to be verbal. But of course, we're having experiences before we have words.
I love the analogy that you gave of the immune system. It's just such a good way of explaining the extent to which we hold feeling in our bodies. And I think, again, we know so much about the baby in the womb once it's getting, almost ready for birth. We know that it will recognize the father's voice and other voices besides the mother's voice. We know that they respond to the stimulus of various sounds and that they will like some sounds and not like other sounds. We know that from a physiological perspective, obviously what mother eats affects the baby. And we also know that there is that the hormones that are coursing through mother's voice, like cortisol, have an effect on the baby and perhaps a predisposition towards depression, etc. So we know all of this. And yet it seems that the missing bit is accepting that they're going to remember. And you're talking about remembering from a very early stage. And I think that what you said there speaks to the reason why so many people have incredibly strong responses that they can't explain to certain situations. And they can't explain it. And some might remember when we're doing regression work, but others, it's things like breath work and body work that brings it up. So I think that explanation is brilliant. Thank you.
Can I say more on that?
Oh, please.
So I think it's important to differentiate between different kinds of memory. In our modern world, we're used to thinking of what we call explicit memory, which is something we can verbalize, we can consciously think about, and put it into chronological time and those kinds of things. Okay, little ones don't have that in the womb. That part of the brain hasn't developed yet, starts developing the first, second year and develops further over time. Uh, it isn't actually totally fully developed in adolescence, which is probably part of the problem we see. But what little ones have is what we call implicit memory, which is nonverbal or pre-verbal. It's in the body, in the cells, in the physiology, in the emotions. And one aspect of implicit memory is that when it comes up, it can be triggered by things, which is the reactions you're talking about, is it feels like it's happening now. It's not about time. And what we see in little ones is that they don't have the ability to differentiate between then and now. So if they start going into a memory, like I do craniosacral therapy amongst other things, and often work with babies, have worked with babies, and they're very ready to show their birth, when they get that there's somebody who might receive them in that. They look at me and they go, "Oh, you get it." Um, and they start going into it. What's really important is to make sure they stay present, that they're making eye contact, that they're staying resourced, that they're capable of not being re-traumatized by it. And that might involve slowing them down or helping them pause, helping them feel mom, usually, hopefully, as a resource, or um, talking with them in certain ways. But that's because they're not capable of differentiating for themselves. If the memory starts coming up, they're in it again. So they can be re-traumatized very easily. And the same is true for people of any age who revisit a memory from that time. They can slip into the implicit memory and get lost there. I've had lots of experience of that myself, which is why I work really differently now, to help people really stay in present time, stay in the resource, the support of our relationship with whoever they're with. Go slowly enough that it's not overwhelming, because little ones process things more slowly than adults do. But they're clearly remembering. And so implicit memory expresses not through words. It might, well, like people kind of unconsciously will say things like, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. I can't get through this. Now, that is clear birth language. Okay, but they're probably not consciously thinking about their birth. It knows what happened to my hands. It went to where my forceps were, right? or where the head has to get through the birth canal. Okay, so we do that kind of thing all the time. People will hold their bodies in a position that reflects how they were. We call it the birth lie side, the side they were lying on at the early in labor. But we also see in the body how people express memories, somatic memories from things that happen in the womb. So just like we go through developmental milestones after birth, we go through the same before birth. So these are moments of challenge that when we meet them, we develop further, we go to the next step. And so, for example, one of those is what we call discovery. I got that term from William Emerson, who's a major pioneer in the field. Um, and he defined it as the time when the pregnancy was confirmed by a pregnancy test. And usually that's around the time when the heart starts beating, which is 22 days after, approximately 22 days after conception. And so memories tend to be held in the area of the body that is most involved in development at the time. So people who had issues at discovery, which might mean that one or both of them, their parents, felt ambivalent about the pregnancy, which is in most pregnancies, even where the pregnancy is wanted, the baby's wanted. Parents go, "Oh my God, I wasn't ready for that." Um, or it could be much more severe than that. Like rejecting the baby or feeling completely incapable of dealing with it or whatever. So that's shocking for the baby. Babies are absolutely dependent on their parents, and especially their mother, for survival. So if they're not welcomed and celebrated and received, they naturally contract, which is what any cell does when it's in danger. Okay. They're more than a cell at that point. So you see people, I used to be like this. I grew 2 inches after I did body work and started, remembering, clearing memories. But they tend to be more caved in. They'll tend towards depression. Um, some people will describe a memory of hiding, trying to stay as small as possible to avoid that moment of discovery. So things like that we hold in our bodies and in our behavior. So I do supervision with people, with different kinds of practitioners, and often new practitioners. They have a really hard time. They have to create a website and make business cards and, put themselves out. And they just can't get themselves to do it. And often in our work together, we come to their time of discovery and they're still holding themselves small. They're terrified of being seen and being rejected. So, they're hiding themselves. So we hold things like that in our bodies and emotionally. So little ones also, as I said, they take in their mother's experience directly. We call it umbilical affect in the field. It could be umbilical, it could just be energetic as well. Somehow they're taking it in. And so if the mother is, say, she's experiencing a lot of anger or a lot of fear, the baby feels that. And then they might tend towards those kinds of feelings throughout their lives without knowing why. Feel a lot of grief, maybe because of the mother's feelings or because of their own loss in the womb.
Listening to you, it's making me think about my work as an astrologer and how often there are certain parts of the chart that describe the birth experience and the pre-birth experience. And very often I'm listening to a person talking about their lives and challenges that they have and the language that they're using. And I'm looking at the chart and I'm thinking, this is describing the birth experience. And I will just quietly ask, do you know anything about your birth? And out comes the story. And then I ask them, is there anything there that you recognize? And suddenly the link appears where they realize that they are describing something that actually happened to them when they were born. I remember a workshop in which, this is years ago now, but it stayed in my mind because it was quite extraordinary. But there was a woman who was talking about a difficulty in starting new ventures, projects, just getting started on anything. And she was saying, it's like I get started and then I feel like I can't go ahead. And it turned out her birth story was that mother was en route to the hospital, I think in a taxi. It's the details are fuzzy, but it was definitely not the place for the baby to be born. And somebody said, "Close your legs, stop the baby coming." And when she told me the story, I looked at her and I said, "Huh, what do you think?" And the look on her face was quite something, because suddenly she realized, oh my goodness, it is exactly that feeling of I'm ready to go, and then whoa, stop,
Yeah,
I can't come. And that's exactly what was happening there with that birth story. And I think that that's a really good example of what we're talking about here.
I agree. Yeah. And it's interesting the patterns or tendencies that can come from birth or prenatal experience. But for example, where there's been an emergency cesarean, um, often those babies find that whenever they're trying to do something, start something or complete something, it's like they're expecting or needing help to come. They don't quite have it in themselves that they can do it themselves. And until they get that, which is, a reason for prenatal and birth therapy, to be able to access what I call our original embryological potential. We all have this potential within us. We know we have this biointelligence. We know, for example, how to get through the birth canal. And in most cases, the various interventions that doctors are so good at aren't actually needed. If there's no intervention means interruption. um, you know, if um, and interventions lead to a whole cascade of interventions. Usually they're not needed because there's an intelligence. We know how to do that. Babies know how to develop. None of us would be here if we hadn't met those developmental milestones in the womb. We've got incredible resilience. We've already done it. We've already survived.
For millennia. So, you know, um, I think, you're talking about cesarean births, and I'm thinking about the rise in cesarean births and what that is going to mean for future generations. But it also, I was thinking about clients I have where I've worked with them to be really confident, about their pregnancy, and to eliminate fear of giving birth and all of this stuff that's out there. And so they're ready, and they are using hypnosis as they go into labor, and they turned up at the hospital. And this has happened so often now, where they turn up at the hospital and they go, I'm ready. And the staff don't believe them because they're nice and calm. And then suddenly they realize, oh, and go into a panic. And my clients go from being perfectly happy and calm to suddenly feeling the panic of the staff around them and losing that, and going into fear that they didn't have before. And I think, again, this is, it's huge, because the very reason I'm helping them is because I want that baby to have the best birth, the best start to life possible, because we know that that has an impact, a positive impact on them. And then here it comes, the chaotic, however well-meaning, chaotic approach as they come into hospital. So yes, what you're saying there is, it really, I resonate with my experience as a therapist working in that way.
Yeah, I feel very sad hearing that. And I know it's true. And, I wish all birth attendants could do their own birth work. Um, I think I know that here in the UK, the NHS is grossly underfunded, and the birth attendants, midwives, doctors, whoever's involved, have way too much to do and not enough time. So they're in a state of hyper arousal. They're going to be sped up, and the hospital is an environment that orients to problems, right? Um, People aren't necessarily even trained in healthy birth. So, my first reaction is, well, why are those women even going to the hospital? You know, we know that um, the contractions labor often stops on the way to hospital as the woman leaves her familiar, calm environment. It may not be calm, but it might be. But at least it's familiar. You take an animal in nature, um, they want to find a quiet, safe place to have their babies. And if a saber-toothed tiger appears, they're not going to give birth in that moment. They're going to hold on to it and run or freeze, whatever they need to do to survive. And then when there's safety, then things open up and their baby can be born. Okay, so there's a lot of the neurophysiology of threat and stress happening in a hospital environment or even just traveling to it. And so I think that's very unfortunate. But as far as I can tell, a lot of birth attendants are acting out their implicit memory. So if they had birth trauma, that may be why they became birth attendants, right? Because they're trying to deal with it. But if they haven't done their own work, to address that, it's going to affect their perceptions. They're going to be oriented to what can go wrong. And they'll try to take action, and that masculine control comes in again, whether they're female or male. We're all influenced by it. It's a very masculine culture, this modern world, right? So they come in and just pass the trauma on, right? So I'm always really deeply touched when people who work with birth and with pregnancy, come and learn about this work and do the work. And I think about, the people that are attending a birth are part of the environment in which the birth happens and having a profound influence. But then there's all those other things happening. Like I think about all the babies being born these days in the Ukraine or in Gaza or um, these days in the States. I mean, there's so much stress going on. And I think I talk about this in the book. I read a news article about a woman in the Ukraine who had her baby during the war, not that long ago. And it was a huge ordeal to get to the hospital. They didn't have gas, petrol, so they had to go and wait in a queue for a very long time until they finally got it. And then they got to the hospital. The hospital was blacked out, because of war, a bombing threat. And when she was on the verge of giving birth, there was an air raid or something. The sirens went off, and so she was taken into a relatively safe room in like a basement, and had her baby in this stark room, right? And her comment apparently was something like, I forget the baby's name, I think it was a boy, I hope my little boy never has to experience anything like this. And I was like, but he did. He was there with you. He was right there. It's going to be in his nervous system. Like these things don't get acknowledged. And that's when they continue. And it could be so powerful just to acknowledge it's like, yeah, we both went through this and that was hard. Even that can be, life changing.
So, what is the best way in which we can promote or encourage a positive prenatal experience in the middle of life's stresses? What can we do to ensure that the best chance of a positive prenatal experience actually happens?
Right. It's a great question, important question. Thank you for that. On behalf of the planet, um, and all the babies coming. I think the first thing we can do is acknowledge that it's an important time. And there are some cultures where, pregnant women are told to stay away from, arguing people, and stay away from bad vibes, like keep things peaceful because it's obvious it affects the baby. So first of all, just to acknowledge that, you bring that much out of shadow, right? People these days don't tend to consider that kind of thing at all in the modern Western world. So to acknowledge that, to talk to the baby. So to acknowledge the baby is present. And so if mom is going through a difficult time, to let the baby know, however they say it, mommy is having a hard time right now and it's not about you. You don't have to worry about it, right? Because babies can't differentiate between what's hers and what's theirs. They just experience it directly and they take it on. And then they might try very hard to take care of her and become what we call a prenatal therapist, you know. So then they live a life of taking care of others and not paying attention to their own needs, right? So just talking to the baby, also warning the baby about things that might happen if interventions need to happen. Let them know, this is what's about to happen, and it's to help you if it's at birth, it's to help you get out. Even doing things like an ultrasound, which babies do feel and apparently can have some harmful effects. But, to let the baby know, that we're um, sending some vibrations in there and you probably will feel something. And it's just because we want to make sure everything's okay. We want to be able to see you and welcome you, so we can make it positive. Right? Um, and some procedures are more invasive that happen prenatally, like some mothers need to have surgery, like say they have uh, appendicitis, they have to have their appendix removed. That's pretty close to the baby. And of course it's going to affect them. Talk to the baby. Let them know, the mommy needs this done right now. And everything's going to be okay. We're working with her and you don't need to worry. You can go over there on the other side of the belly, of the womb. um, so, talking to the baby. If we let the baby know what's going to happen or what could happen, they can be more prepared and it's not as shocking because they're easily startled and easily shocked.
I love that. I spend when I am working with mums to be. It is I'm it's so important that dialogue is there, and in all the visualizations, there's always that conversation with the baby. So I recognize that, and I also I give the fathers a job, and the fathers is to make sure that nobody around this baby that's coming is going to be talking about their I call them the war stories about labor, these horrible stories of trauma in labor. This is not the conversation that mother needs right there. Particularly also, I think it's very important, and I'm sure you'll recognize this, the trauma for mothers who have very difficult birthing experiences. And this is now, and they're pregnant again, and they are so afraid of having the same thing happen again. So there's so many layers here, and it really is about healing, because I guess the next question actually I was going to ask you, which fits into this, is about bonding postpartum and the difficulty that so many women have with bonding with the baby because they've just had a horrific birthing experience. They're exhausted. They haven't got anything in them. Um, and so and here we are. So how what would you recommend in terms of encouraging that positive bonding postpartum? Um, because we want a secure attachment. Secure attachment is so important in
Yes.
terms of the psychological development of the baby. How do we do this?
Right. Well, first of all, avoid the birth trauma if possible, but assuming we can't. I think one of the most important things, no matter what, if there's any way it's possible, is to have the mother and the baby together, baby on the mother, with the option to breastfeed. And that will support both of them. Breastfeeding also releases oxytocin, and that supports delivery of the placenta, which is important for the mother's health so she doesn't hemorrhage. Um, but also, oxytocin supports bonding. So, one of the problems is that one of the interventions is to use synthetic oxytocin to induce the birth. And that creates very strong, fast contractions that are generally overwhelming for both mother and baby without any pauses to rest. But also, it doesn't have that um, supporting the bonding aspect to it. So, to avoid that if possible, but breastfeeding can help to bring it back. And just having skin to skin contact, both of them are going to be able to settle more if they have that. I remember uh, what's his name? Joseph Chilton Pierce. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He died, unfortunately, maybe 10 years ago, I think. He was this absolutely brilliant man um, who looked at early childhood education, I think, but he also looked at birth and the heart function. And, I remember him talking about how if the mother and baby are separated, the mother's nervous system acts as if the baby has died. And the baby, of course, doesn't live in time. They can't go, oh, this is just going to happen for a few hours or whatever it is. They are completely separated from the only person they've been close to. I mean, you can't be any closer than a mother and her unborn baby. Baby's inside her. Their hearts are resonating. The baby's heart develops its rhythm in relationship to the mother's heart. So if the baby doesn't have the mother near them, the stress hormones of birth continue and they can't settle. And the mother can't settle. Right? They actually absolutely need each other. And sometimes that is difficult. Um, it seems like a lot of the situations where modern medicine believes they have to be separated, that's not actually the case. That skin to skin actually supports the baby in receiving what they need and
I was
regulating.
I was just thinking as I was listening to you about what would happen if we thought that dogs, that puppies were separated from their mothers as soon as they were born. The outcry that would happen, quite rightly, if that was to happen, or kittens from their mothers as they were born.
Yes, because
There
we
was
need that.
absolute outrage. And yet it is considered to be almost the civilized thing to do, to take the baby away because mother needs to rest. And I agree, mother needs to rest, but can we do something that is not going to create this artificial separation? Because in nature this would not happen.
No, and ironically, mother can't really rest if she doesn't have her baby with her.
Exactly.
And again, that might be different on a conscious level. Usually mothers want their baby with them. But maybe she just wants to go to sleep, But she can go to sleep with her baby with her. But her body is going to be longing for her baby on every level.
And see, again, what you're talking about there is the body is longing for. And so this comes back to the unarticulated feeling. And I think that we are where we are with this because we are so encouraged to be disconnected from our bodies. Everything is cerebral. And so we're almost not fully embodied anymore because we're in our heads all the time. And I think this is the difficulty. So I for that reason I am extra grateful for your time today in talking to us, and deeply grateful for this beautiful book, which, a reminder to everyone, is called The Prenatal Shadow, a link to which will be in the description box. Cherionna, if people want to find you and your work, how do they do that?
Well, first of all, to say the book should be available wherever books are sold. Um, it's got a great distributor, so I'm happy about that. My website is birthingyourlife.org, and that's the easiest way to find me. I'm also on Facebook with my name, Cherionna Menzam or Menzam-Sills, and I have a Birthing Your Life Facebook page. So, um, and LinkedIn and all those things.
Well, I'll make sure that all the links are in the description box. And I want to thank you again for your time today.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and thank you for, caring about this. You obviously have a passion that I think matches mine. So I thank you for that. We can do this. We can wake up the world.
Oh, indeed. Thank you. And thank you all for watching. A reminder that also in the description box, you are going to find my Substack as well as my websites. And until next time, I wish you a brilliant week. Goodbye.